what differentiates the top 1% of designers in India today from the rest?
I think a lot of designers know how to make great craft. I think the top 1% of designers, because of their generalist mindset, also understand when to do it. Our definition of aesthetics are often created by what we see on a day-to-day basis. Definitely, India design scene is much more younger as compared to, let's say the scene in the Europe or in the US.
Hey there, welcome to Design Oops with Indiefolio. Today we have Saurabh Soni with us, the head of design at Razorpay. Razorpay is one company which is known to be one of the pioneers in setting up a design community and culture in India. Saurabh today runs one of the largest in-house design teams for a product company. We talk a lot about his journey, his career, starting from housing till today. A lot of advice for young designers and as well as designers to be leaders. Hey Saurabh, thanks for your time and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, hi Kavan, super excited to be here.
You've been working at a company which has been doing some incredible work, especially in design. And, I can't wait to kind of unpack a lot of questions I have for you. So the first thing I really wanted to know is about how you got the design bug. You did engineering at BITS and I was looking at your LinkedIn profile. You've been designing since school days. I've seen you also been part of a lot of events and other, I think IPs also when you were a student. So is there any particular project which got you curious about design and you made a decision that, okay, this is where I want to build my career in?
I think my journey with design had started long back, even when I knew what design was. In fact, I think the habit is an amalgamation of two things that I remember from my childhood. The first one was, my dad has been a tinkerer. In fact, a lot of people in my family have been a tinkerer and they like to DIY a lot of things. On the other front, my mother taught me about empathy from beginning. In fact, her way of telling me this thing was, always think that what the other person would possibly be, thinking about, what might be the thing at their end. And I think when I use that tinkering habit and this mother's learning, and when at the age of, I think around 10, I got my first computer, I started to build things instead of using that time on computer to play games. So I think around that was that time when you would get CDs and a lot of softwares, and I would try them out. There was something where you could, I think it was called Audacity long back, or like a software equivalent to that where you could play with sounds, trim it, and I really loved that thing. There were photo editing apps, there were apps with which you can customize your Winamp skin, and I used to spend a lot of time over there. So I think the first proper project as such, I remember it was something I feel proud of, was this thing in Macromedia Flash, and that was not Adobe Flash long back. I had built some basic things. I learned how, click interactions and everything work. And that's where I thought that, hey, I need to do something, really good, because I could see what others were making, via these software CDs. I was curious about science. What I did was I created a solar system app. So there was a sun in the center and then planets are rotating around it. And you could see all 9 planets. And, remember back then we had 9. So you could, as a user, you could go and click onto one of those planets and, it would show a pop-up where you could see the name, detailed photograph that I would, of course, scrape through one of the encyclopedia tools back then. And then, there were design problems I realized that I was even thinking of back then. For example, I showed it to, my dad and he would try to click on a planet and I realized, hey, it needs super precision. You need to be exactly on that orbit or on that planet to click on it. So I was like, hey, how can I really increase that click radius so that it's easy for someone to actually click on it? And then I figured out, okay, I can put up a dummy element behind that, orbit so that it's clickable. I figured out that, okay, if the planet is on the right side, but the orbit is on left side, it feels pretty odd to be clicking on it. And then I realized, hey, I think I need to have a hover effect. So that was a lot of like DIY learning, even on how to create experiences. But I think that eventually came out really well. Of course, I hadn't figured out how to crack the distribution. So nobody would have probably seen it beyond few friends where I circulated it. But I think that was, one of the first ones where I think the modern design journey for me began.
Awesome. How old were you when you made that?
I think this was 7th or 8th standard, so maybe like 12, 13 years old.
Wow, that's and where did you learn how to do stuff like this?
So all this was pretty organic. I think back then I had spent almost 6 months just figuring out that how do you create more frames in, Flash, and how do you do those clicks? How do you figure out these are the logics among it? But a lot of tinkering only helped me learn. Internet wasn't that common of a thing back then. There was a dial-up modem and all of that. So internet wasn't a lot helpful. So yeah, a lot of figuring out.
That's absolutely insane, I want to ask you a question which a lot of tinkerers have in their mind actually. On one end they feel, hey, engineering seems like a good path for me. A lot of them feel design is a good path for me. And unfortunately the way choices have to be made, in with younger kids, you have to decide a stream and people are really apprehensive or rather confused. What's that right thing for me? And you've switched streams yourself. But I think after learning engineering and then pursuing design, what's your advice to people, maybe in their 11th or 12th, if they like tinkering? How do I know what I'm really good at and what path I should pick?
That's an interesting one. In fact, back then, of course, I did not have a lot of choices. JEE was the thing that everyone got into. So these days, what I am seeing, the awareness about design as a career has gotten a lot better. The universities have started courses which are actually truly multidisciplinary, from the sense that, I have one of my younger cousins who is right now at IIT Mumbai and, doing his design course. And he talks about the variety of things that they have been working on. So in fact, like all in all, my advice would be you could choose any path, but for someone to be truly good or a great designer, it really requires learning much beyond even just, engineering or design. The learning would never end. In fact, I have spent a lot of my time learning about business, about aspects on marketing, aspects on product management, engineering. So I think the list is endless. Pick up starting point. If if like the shorter advice would be this, that if you are already passionate about something, if you feel that this is going to be something that I would put my whole of my energy in getting that right, I would say that choose that path at that point in time, because that would help you get ahead the fastest.
That's absolutely brilliant advice. I feel the more you try, the more you tinker, it's better. And don't get into like an analysis paralysis that, oh, what to do, and I like 10 things. Just pick one thing, try it. Even if you fail, you'll barely be 20 years old, So that's the advantage of, I think, trying things very quickly when you're young. I want to now move into asking you your hot take for the design industry in India. You have been in the landscape for over a decade. You've hired lots of people, and I'm assuming you mentored much more than that. So what is your hot take about the India design landscape?
So a few months back, I had a visit to US, and in fact, in general, I've been trying to get a sense on how, what are the various things that people across different organizations in India have been learning, what they have been doing. One of the things that I have realized that definitely India design scene is much more younger as compared to, let's say the scene in the Europe or in the US. And the way in which we are learning about design is often a lot derived from what's happening in the US or what's happening in the European market. And sure, there is a lot of knowledge or lot of resources which are available on what was the final outcome. For example, how did a particular screen look like? What were the interactions? But very little knowledge that's available on how that path was achieved. In fact, that's often a very deep knowledge that exists within companies, and it's hard to put it out. So our learning has happened a lot more at the visual layer, and because of which what I feel has happened is on the visual front, we have, picked up or taken a lot of inspiration from the Western market, and we are applying it as is for the Indian consumers. In fact, I see, designers often talking about minimalism or, certain design languages, which are often a thing within West. And in fact, the Western society is hyper evolved on aesthetics. In fact, you would see literally on the roads when you step out, when you see how their houses or how their stores might be designed. But here it's a very different thing. So I feel that we need to figure out our own style of aesthetic than to be picking up directly from a particular market. For example, if you would see what happens in the China market or what happens in my recent trip to Japan, I saw some of the apps that are made in Japan, how differently they are designed. And this was figuring out a lot of in terms of what does that market in itself require. And in fact, I can tell you a recent example. So about a year back, we were redesigning our checkout experience. And one of the major areas of focus was how do we improve on our aesthetics, to 10x of where it was before that. And of course, the call that we took around that time was, let's not simply learn from what exists in the market, but learn ground up from our customers, right? And when we started to do that, of course, we had to figure out those experiments, the ways in which we would learn that. But to our surprise, the things that we would call as, hey, this is too black and bold and too plain vanilla. For example, we had a button where you could see like a big bold pricing written out that, hey, this is how much you're gonna pay. And we thought that it was ugly, but still let's experiment and let's learn. To our surprise, we realized that what we called as ugly and what often, you and I would also call as ugly, turned out that consumers like it for its simplicity, for its boldness, for its, it's just out there. And I believe that there are many such patterns, and we need to do a lot more exploration on, as Indian design community, we need to do a lot more explorations, a lot more learning on what are those aesthetic design pattern that works the best for our kind of audience.
Why do you think Indians love ugly? I always ask myself that, right? Where you can crib a lot about a lot of our government platforms, but they're effective, is what I often hear. I recently spoke to a unicorn co-founder who also said we went the ugly side and the conversions increased. They again tap into tier 2. So what any perspective you have on why is it that the mass in India prefers that?
I think the modern designers, a lot of us who have been working with tech companies, our understanding of aesthetics has been learned. And that has been learned through what we have seen from the designs, which in, let's say, the Western world are called beautiful, right? In fact, any eye over the time gets trained over what is supposed to look beautiful and what is not beautiful, right? Of course, there are natural aspects to it as well. For example, when you look at certain, say, plants or a landscape, you would have a perception. But on man-made things, we have been taught and we learned that what is beautiful and what is not beautiful. That's there. The other thing that I was, and then this is a hypothesis, that our definition of aesthetics are often created by what we see on a day-to-day basis. And for example, if you look at a typical street, a typical house, or a typical shop, right? All of these places we have. I remember my house back in the childhood, right? It was all filled with a lot of things. There are photos all across. There are showpieces decorated all across. And from looking at all of this diversity of things all across, right? This is my, has been my understanding that could be a very strong reason why a lot of Indian mass evolved to like that style where there are a lot of things all across, because we have grown and learned to like that environment.
That's a perspective I've not thought about, actually. So thanks for that. I think a lot for me to think and discuss over. But, I absolutely agree. I feel we've just duplicated what others are doing, and maybe we've trained the population also, I wouldn't say incorrectly, but in a certain way, instead of really looking beneath and seeing what generally works. Another app which came to my mind while you spoke was M Indicator, right? Like in Bombay, like millions of people rely on it, and it has, I think, it's a very unique way of doing what they do. Want to now jump into, I think, a very important part about the conversation today, which is design ops. I think we're at a time where a lot of designers will be expected to become good managers. And when it comes to you joined Razorpay, I believe almost 7-8 years ago as a senior designer. Then you became a principal and lead. then you became a manager, then you became a manager of a manager, and today you're the head of design at, I believe, one of the largest in-house design teams in the country for a product company, right? For a unicorn. Without really knowing what a good manager is, how did you adjust to a leadership position? If you can give any guidance or just talk about your experience about that, would be fantastic.
Yeah. In fact, this was, while transitioning from individual contributor designer to like designer who was helping others, mentoring them, to a person where, suddenly some of my peers had become my reports. I think this entire phase had massive amounts of learning for me. And, I've seen like a lot of people who have a similar journey go through some of those similar, challenges as well. For example, one of the biggest one was, as a designer, you build a taste for what is supposed to be right design, right? And you know it subconsciously that this is right. And often it's hard to explain it really well that why does it feel right. And you build your own way of working. And as soon as you are working with other designers and who are either reporting to you or, you have to make sure that whatever work that they are doing comes out and solves the problem that, they're set out for. There is this feeling that, hey, I know the answer, but the person I'm working with, why aren't they really reaching to the same answer that I have in my mind? What would it take to reach there, right? And the wrong thing to do at that point in time is to, like tactically tell to that person that, hey, move this here, move that around here, we can do it like this. And in fact, when I was going through this journey, I realized that this is a pretty bad way because, if I were that designer who was receiving such an advice, I would not feel the ownership of my work. In fact, I would not feel the same kind of excitement. So rather, what really works is to set outcomes. For example, instead of saying that, hey, can we make this button bigger? Probably a better advice is outcome oriented, that, hey, how would we make sure that the user realizes on the screen what they are exactly supposed to do? And that's when I started to tap into the purpose for which I would have a particular design feedback. And instead of having my feedback phrased as make this change, I started to phrase it as how can we get this outcome? And I realized that that made the relationship between me and my reports or my mentees super collaborative. And at the same time, they and I, both of us, found the fulfillment of the joy of the work. So that's been one major thing.
It's like hard relate to what you just said. I want to follow up though here, Saurabh. So I've seen this happen where you've been made a manager of a particular pond or a particular group of designers which you may or may not have worked with before or hired yourself. The accountability falls on your shoulder to get this particular outcome. And what you mentioned right now is, trust the team, be patient, try, and then see the result. Which sometimes, managers are like, just do what I say. I know I'm right. And just get it done. And it'll happen in 1 hour versus 3 days. So how do I battle that voice in my mind, right? Because I think long term, this does not work. It's bad culture and it's just bad leadership. So if I'm facing that, and a lot of ICs face this when they are, making that jump, how do you combat with this voice in your head?
The simple answer to this in my head, and this was when I started my managerial journey, was if I continue to do all of this, then the team would never become independent and I would not get time to solve even tougher problems. So I might be saving, instead of getting something done in 3 days, I might be helping the team to get done in 1 day today. But I would always continuously need to invest my time, getting that done. And in fact, that designer would probably also not enjoy, and, there is a long-term risk of either the person not enjoying their work and probably finding something else where they find more excitement. And at the same time, I would not get time to do and solve maybe larger problems, which might be problems of, 5 designers in my team combined, having a problem that none of them individually could possibly work on, but I would need to work on. The thing is, the thought has been this, that if I do not, hand over how I do things, the problems that I solve today to rest of my team, I would not get time to solve bigger problems. And that's been the selfish reason. And of course, there is a reason for the long-term benefit of the team as well.
On training a team, like any advice you have there as well, where if you want to kind of replicate your best practices to somebody else, how to do it? Because, People make like a guidebook or a cheat sheet, and then you realize after 6 months nobody's even looking at it and they're doing something different. So any advice there?
So, for example, something like this this mindset became quite handy when I became manager of managers. And now what I was doing to the rest of the team that, hey, give them outcome-based feedback, let them solve, let them figure out their own methods. Now I had to coach this mindset to, my team, my direct reports, who were now people managers themselves. While figuring this out, I had more learnings that, how do you coach? One thing I realized that, of course, you need to give people time to learn, and you need to keep on discussing and talking about the same things multiple times. It's very rarely when someone would just learn when you tell them once. So in fact, you might tell them theoretically, in a one-on-one conversation. But then you would need to also follow up onto the same advice when that thing is actually happening. Maybe give some corrective feedback at that point in time when that thing has just happened, and right after that you drop a small Slack message that, hey, this is something you could possibly correct on. So my learning has been that, one, it needs a multiple set of nudges. Second has been, I think again the same thing, that talk to them about the outcomes. And in this case with managers, I would talk about the outcome that they need to achieve is, hey, if you want to solve problems like, how do you make sure that now the overall revamp of this product line happens? If you really want to solve a problem statement like this, you need to make sure that all the tactical projects on a day-to-day basis are independently handled by your team, and so that you could do this. And again, this outcome-based learning instead of activity-based learning.
Fantastic. Couldn't agree more here. You mentioned about mindset, and I think a great way to shape a mindset is through culture. When somebody says culture should be good and you as a head of design or a leader need to shape culture in the company, people get very scared, right? They're like, what does culture actually even mean? Any pointers there, any opinion there on things you have done to really create the Razorpay culture, and firstly define what the Razorpay culture is?
So let me share this quick story about how I found what's the right operating culture. And by culture, I mean how should people interact with each other, and what's the community feeling within a team. So my first experience was housing, which was where I learned a lot about the craft of design. But my second experience, I was the first employee of a very early stage cryptocurrency startup, and this was way early in 2015, 2016. And what I learned over there is, so whenever I would design something, I would know that, hey, there are more aspects on engineering, there are more aspects on business side, there are more aspects on how we want to position our product. And for me to create a great design in the first shot, it's very important that I understand a lot beyond the traditional, design, right? How could I understand and inherit all of those aspects to create something great? And now, after this startup didn't work out, at that point in time, I joined Razorpay. And I had this thing in my mind that I really need to work with cross-functional teams, like literally every function. Don't have a subset over here. And when I came here, I started to do that thing, and I realized that my craft started to get a lot better. In fact, I was able to crack a design in the first shot, and it would not go through iterations of 10 cycles, because I could get inputs and I could think from perspective of, hey, what would a business person think about? What would a PM care about? What would an engineering person care about? And with all of this, I could crack that multidisciplinary designing does not just mean multiple aspects of how to solve design, but also what all things you could take into account while solving for design. And now how we translated this into culture. So about 2 years into my journey at Razorpay, I transitioned into team, a new vertical that we were beginning back then, neo banking vertical, and now this was a small team. So it became like a ground for me to experiment on a bunch of these aspects on culture as well. And what I had also learned by that time, by reading a bunch of books around how startups in Valley were working, was they embraced this culture to deepest of the extents. And PMs, designers, engineering, they work as a single unit. And when this new team had set up, we brought in about 2 practices. The first practice was, how could a designer extend way beyond what they were doing on a day-to-day basis? For example, a designer would take things which were at the periphery of design and something else. Let's say we are redesigning a customer. There is a customer who has certain needs on, I want to shape up, this product experience this way. And, we had for certain reason taken a call that, okay, we would accommodate a request like this. So the designer would become POC for that customer, have those conversations, and designers learned about how to interact with customers and in fact how to even pitch them that, hey, this is the right solution for you. There would be certain projects which are super experience heavy. For example, while designing for custom roles, so in a typical B2B organization, you would have like multiple people who are accessing your product, and you need to figure out who could see what and basis what rules. And for that, a designer took the role of a PM and figured out, learned from customers, and brought in all those insights that how we should build a product. So we kept doing more and more of these things, and we saw that designers were enjoying all of this, designers were enjoying the ownership, and they could get out some of the best experiences when they operated this way. So designers going out started to become a part of the culture where they were taking ownership of things way beyond just design. The second thing that also boosted it, which was the other way around, which is bringing in everyone to do design solutions. So we call it like co-design hours. And there what happens is you put out a workshop, you put out the problem statement to everyone, a PM, an engineer, in fact the entire engineering team, bunch of folks from business side, from marketing side, everyone would jump in, and the problem statement is put out to everyone, and now everyone wireframes together, right? There is a 1 hour slot for 15 minutes to half an hour, everyone would create their wireframes. And towards the end, people would very quickly talk about that this is what they are thinking, how the problem should be solved, and why is it so. And it helped us learn massively. One, of course, the design that otherwise would be done, the number of iterations that would otherwise be done in a week could be now done in an hour. And the other thing was we could learn that how a marketing person is thinking about positioning this product, how an engineering person is thinking about what constraints they would take into account while trying to solve for it. How a PM is taking into account that, hey, if we need to meet these outcomes, we need to, solve it this way. And that just like whichever projects went through this kind of a process, we reached great outcomes much sooner, and the team felt a lot of joy in operating this way. So I think these were the two practices that helped shape up design culture. And now my idea is to, make sure that all these practices become very widely adopted across the org.
Super fun place Razorpay sounds like to work with, I want to follow up here once again on hybrid and remote work cultures. You may have experienced that during COVID, and I'm assuming you still may have some hybrid model. I'm not sure. What's your feedback on building similar experiences when you are a hybrid or a remote team?
So the good thing is now with the kind of tools that we have, and it has become a lot easier than it was ever before. In fact, we started this practice during the COVID times. In fact, this entire thing was there when lockdown had happened, and the teams were more distant than they ever were. And we used to use, like say, and during these wireframe sessions, the tool was not a constraint. So I was seeing like PMs actually designing those things on Excel sheets. A designer maybe using pen and paper and taking photo of it and then putting it on one of the Slack threads. Maybe someone like, so the tool wasn't really a constraint, and that helped us get through even in a hybrid setting, even in a remote setting.
Fantastic. I think that's some great validation for anybody who's also confused ki aise kaise kare in terms of hybrid and remote. I'm a remote company, so I also wanted to kind of follow up on that. I want to now talk about similar topics you covered, which is about collaboration, and I also want to talk about consistency. So you must have joined Razorpay at a time where there was like a limited team or even a limited focus for you individually. And since then, I believe now you do product communication. You're obviously also handling the P&L of the design department. And you also, have seen the company go from just a few designers to over 100. How do you make sure that there is effective collaboration and proper consistency? Because kya hota hai, once you set up something 6 years down the line for you, something else is happening completely different. And I see a lot of managers struggling, with scaling their design practices. So any guidance you have for that?
So I can maybe help understand this with example of how we solved it at Razorpay. There was one product line when I had joined, and as Razorpay kept expanding, we kept adding product lines. But also at the same time, we also had acquisitions. So there were entirely new product lines where none of us in the team had worked on, either in terms of experience or in terms of engineering. They started to come in as a part of product suite at Razorpay. In fact, even internally, when we were building some of these things, each of the teams had that independence, and that was intentional for those teams to move fast. And during that time, those teams took certain calls that, hey, we would want to shape up our experience in this particular way. And we had like a wide variety of experiences, ranging from a product that looked, white and, with hints of blue, to a product that was fully dark and, had a entirely orange and blue color theme. Now, when we started to have the conversations about consistency, and we didn't want to do consistency for the sake of it, right? Because, how consistency translates into business outcomes, that had to be clear. So when we started to do the conversation and we started to learn from the customers, we realized that of the problems that our customers have, consistency or ensuring that everything, looked and feel similar was probably 10th in their priority list. They had so many other problems. Nobody was complaining about it, and no one looked at it as one of the top problems on their mind. So of course, from this lens, that did not make sense. But the other lens with which we were super clear why we really need to do it was making sure the goodness of one team could come over to the other team, and we are able to ship out great products much faster. In fact, how could we make sure that this becomes our moat, that as we keep on becoming bigger and bigger, instead of becoming slower, we could, use the goodness from all across the teams. So that's where about 4 years or so back, we started the conversation on design system. And in fact, at this point in time, we have reached to, very high levels of sophistication where, we built a design system that could work both in the light and dark themes. There was a slow migration, while we ensured that none of the business outcomes get affected. How do we continue to keep making sure things are getting more and more consistent? So, the entire design system bit helped a lot. In fact, now we are evolving that part to even have very deep patterns. So to give you an example, every product has a onboarding journey at Razorpay. For example, if someone wants to use payments, there is a journey. Someone wants to use part of the neo banking suite, there is a onboarding for that. And each of the teams were figuring out on their own, what's the best experience, what's the right way to show it to customers. And instead, what we did was we structured our organization in itself in a way where these things become organic instead of them becoming, a forced thing. So now we have a team which works on a bunch of such aspects. So for example, we have now made this entire onboarding modular where any team could just pick it out, plug in their modules, and then there are best practices which are written over there, and something that previously would possibly take like months to build can now be built in few weeks only. So like we have been able to achieve that kind of velocity as well as the design outcomes, like the design quality aspects as well.
Brilliant. So I think you busted a myth of a lot of founders ki if you're doing 0 to 1, you need to first build a design system, I think unfortunately I see some people putting their designers on that because they've read design systems are cool by Uber or Airbnb someday. But then I think as you scale at the kind of level you scale at, design systems become a pretty integral part of maintaining, consistency. Just generally, I wanted to kind of ask you on these projects you worked at, right? Like there are so many things you said you did. Any particular product or a project which is close to your heart, which maybe had a fantastic outcome or it felt very fulfilling for you?
So I would say maybe that project is, in fact, bunch of such projects are currently ongoing, but I can talk about a project that we had recently launched and, all of us had across the org had come together in various bits and pieces to make that happen. So this was the checkout redesign project, which I was talking about just earlier. And the backstory of that is when Razorpay began back in 2014, the hero product for us was our checkout experience and, the dashboard experience, of course, which are merchant site. And when that had happened, we remember that whenever we used to go to a sales call or, whenever a customer would see, like a business would see the checkout experience, they'd be like, hey, I want this, right? And the product had created that kind of a pull. And over the years, this kept evolving. We kept adding more functionalities, more payment methods, more and more capabilities to, make that customer experience much more seamless. And then we had bunch of big and small redesigns. But as the product kept becoming more and more complex and, internally from a structured lens, now there were so many teams which are working on it, teams which are working on international expansion were working on it, teams on the marketing suite side of things, where, how do we give out the right kind of offers and nudges and everything to the user. They started to work on it. And we realized that the structure had become a bit complex for everyone to work on it. And also at the same time, because the competition was starting to catch up. And of course, we were super clear that design is one of the things that Razorpay has always been known for, and we want to continue to do that. It was time to do that 10xing again, that from the previous state to a new state, how do we make sure that the entire checkout experience, both in terms of aesthetics and the perception, as well as the scalability of it, we create a 10x product. And that's what we set out to do about 2 years back. And then about a year back, we had completed that. So this took roughly a worth of time frame. We had a lot of learnings on aesthetics, which we were just talking about, right? And while there is generally a lot of science on UX, we started to make science about aesthetics as well. That how is that customers perceive it? How do we design those surveys and questionnaires to get a more objective sense on what are the right aesthetics for us? And then this entire journey, after which eventually we have a super modular design where so many things are configurable, and at the same time aesthetically we believe that it did that 10xing that we really required to. I believe like this was one of the most fulfilling experiences, both as a designer and as a person who really cares about how do our customers get that right kind of experience.
Brilliant. Is this live, by the way?
Yes, this is live.
Okay. I'm definitely going to go and check it out somewhere. I'm sure I'll be able to get a glimpse. So many people use your product, so it'll naturally come to me. I want to just ask you one more question around compliance and the fintech world, right? I have a few clients in this area. Even going to your office is a headache, right? Like you have to there's so much compliance even to kind of visit player who processes payments, right? There must be so many more restrictions where it comes to the product. I have some clients in the insurance domain, and literally the leadership also needs to approve some of the smallest things because there is a huge, penalty if you get things wrong. So do you have any example of maybe things Razorpay can't do which maybe other companies can, or any particular quirky or an odd compliance point which you have to keep in mind while designing fintech products?
So one thing we always keep in mind is the user comes the first, right? There might be a lot of complexity behind, either in terms of the technical complexity, or there could be regulatory complexity. But our job as an organization, and especially designer's job, is to make sure we make lives of our users simple. I'll tell you about a story, and this was a very interesting one. So the neo-banking product that's there, one of our banking partners, because of certain regulatory push, decided that instead of Razorpay sending the OTP and collecting on our own interface, we would require to take the user to bank's site where only the registered number with the bank could actually enter the OTP to make a transaction. And now just imagine, right, there are businesses who are having like 50 people who are probably managing their money movements and transactions by Razorpay, and it would become such a hassle. And of course, when that discussion started, designers and of course everyone across the org started to figure out that how is that we could make sure that this is not as painful experience. So the first thing we did was we worked with the bank to figure out that, hey, this is going to be a very painful experience for the customers, and we don't really want to go to such kind of an extent where we have such breaking changes for them. The first thing we negotiated and worked out with the bank was, instead of having OTP getting collected on the bank interface, can we have APIs so that we can have that direct integration? The second thing we worked with is how is that we could have more and more users from that business get onboarded even onto the bank experience, so that the friction is minimal. And the eventual solution that we rolled out, and this was a fairly small amount of time when we made all of these changes and, did all the negotiations and made sure the customers have minimalist amount of breakage. That was, truly like, it was magical to see that how all the teams came together to make sure customer experience does not get hindered. There's another example. For example, when we have the onboarding experience, now recently with the evolved PAPG guidelines, which RBI had released, the entire businesses on this front are getting way more regulated, which of course means higher degree of scrutiny when you are trying to onboard a customer. To make sure that we get this experience right, we are spending a good amount of time. In fact, we are not waiting for the regulations to become stricter around it. We are taking steps ahead to make sure that we are learning much more faster. We are, designs, prototypes, learning from customers. Being in fintech space, you are bound to get all of these regulatory technical challenges and everything, and it's a tough job to make sure you get the experience right, but I think that's a true job.
What you said about the previous example is just so encouraging, that so many people give a damn about customer centricity in India today, which I think has been a change, thanks to companies like you and just more modernization of the way we build products in the country. So thanks for the example, very specific one. We're at the end of the podcast. I have one last question to ask you now. But generally, I think you've given some fantastic advice to a lot of young and senior professionals, and it'll definitely help them. If you can give a final advice, right? I'd love to understand if we can help people take away here that if I want to succeed as a design leader one day, they want to be in your shoes one day, what it really takes. And the way I'd like you to answer it is by telling me what differentiates the top 1% of designers in India today from the rest.
All right. So on to the design manager thing, right? I think my biggest learning when I became a design manager was becoming a manager is no different from being a designer yourself. Just that your problem statements expand from just being user problems to user problems plus, a much more broader gamut of things, your team problems and everything. And your canvas changes from, just a screen to everything out there. So in fact, as a designer, I started to embrace the, much larger canvas and much larger problem set. And when I started to see things from that lens, my excitement towards design management, became a lot more, as well as what I could see what possibly could be done in that area. I started to see a lot of unconventional things that otherwise I would have seen that, hey, there is a supposed to be way of managing. So that's there. What I believe differentiates that 1%, top 1% of designers. I think a lot of designers know how to make great craft, how to, make sure that, all those pixels are perfect, bringing in a lot of motion, transition, animations, and that aesthetics that are required, solving a lot of deep edge cases and everything. But I think the top 1% of designers, because of their generalist mindset, also understand when to do it.
Absolutely. I think you summed it up very well in that one statement towards when to do it. Can I ask you to expand a little bit more? So how does one know the timing is right?
So I'll talk about this example. So we had started to see that on our onboarding journey, we were receiving a lot more customer support queries. And, when we dive deeper into it, we realized that, there are, certain parts of the flow which aren't working as expected. There are certain parts where, the communication that we give out to customer is ambiguous, is vague, right? And somewhere fundamentally the way in which the entire flow is put out is not right. Now, if someone wears, wholesome design hat, one would say that, hey, we need to revamp this entire flow and we need to make sure that, hey, these all aspects are done right and, we create a framework and everything around that. Sure, that might be a, good long-term solve, but at that point in time, and coming to that when, right? At this point in time, what is really required is customers are having pain right now. There are certain copy changes. If we do those copy changes, we would see immediate solve of the problem that's out there, there are certain parts of the flow where the flow does not work as expected, and there are smaller changes that we could possibly do. So sure, there might be a perfect solution that exists, which a designer would have so much joy in putting out and showing it to the world. But at the same time, at this situation, it was really required for us to solve a lot more shorter term problems, even if they were not the most sexiest problems to work on. Still, we had to make sure that we get the experience right, and before we get into a longer term solve, which we of course then phased it out and eventually did a long term solve as well.
Fantastic. I feel, this thought process, this mindset gets created when you just go out of the craft of design and look at your overall role in the organization to move the business forward. And I think that just generally helps you understand, okay, build frugally, build fast, solve immediate problems, instead of being like, hey, I'm here to create a work of art. And only when it's a work of art is when I will feel satisfied. So I think some brilliant advice to conclude the podcast on. Thanks for explaining that once again, Saurabh. And this is the end of the pod. Thank you so much. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners also have. I hope you had a good time.
Yeah, Kavan, had a good time, and thank you so much for having me here.
Superb. For everybody who's also tuned in, thank you so much for watching the podcast till now. If you'd like another design leader like Saurabh very, very soon, please like, share and subscribe. There'll be another episode coming out very, very soon. Bye-bye.